I think most of us here are quote unquote repeat offenders, so we will begin. My name's Michael Simonson. I'm an archivist and the head of public outreach here at the Leo Beck Institute. I'm also the head of reference. Today we are discussing the book A Journey to the Millennium, a novel of the Middle Ages by A.B. Yehoshua. This is my copy here. We probably all have our own copies. I actually, for the first time, read this book, though I had it in hard copy, I read it on my Kindle, which I had just got as a gift. So that was a new experience for me. Our guest today is Ranen Omer-Sherman. And he is the Jewish Heritage Fund for Excellence Endowed Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Louisville. He's the author or editor of 5 books, including Diaspora and Zionism in Jewish American Literature, Israel in Exile, Jewish Writing in the Desert, the Jewish graphic novel Critical Approaches, Narratives of Dissent, War in Contemporary Israeli Arts and Culture, Imagining Kibbutz, Visions of Utopia in Literature and Film, and a work titled Amos Oz, The Legacy of a Writer in Israel and Beyond, as well as numerous essays on Jewish writers from Israel and North America, including Yehoshua. And in fact, he's working, he can tell us about this in a few minutes. He's working on a new project about him. So it is perfect timing. In addition, he serves as co-editor of Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies. He was a founder of a desert kibbutz. He has served as a combat soldier in the IDF. He has worked for many years as a desert guide in the Sinai and in the Negev. So welcome, Ranen. We're happy you joined us today. And you can start providing the introduction. And when you're done, just let me know you're finished and I'll take it over again from there.
Sounds good. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. As for the Negev and Sinai, for me, that was like a lifetime ago. Plunk me down there, and I'm sure I'd be instantly lost, but they were good years. So, anyway, I'm really delighted to join what seems to me to be a really exceptional book group, a very dedicated book group, and I'm grateful to Michael for his invitation. On a personal note, before we get underway, I'll just share that the loss of Aleph Bet Yehoshua, or as some of you might know, Bully, which was a nickname he was called ever since childhood, it was very painful for me, and I'm sure it was for you. I knew him, and I hosted him in Miami, and I met with him in his beloved Haifa, and he was on tour some years ago before his death with a what I consider a really wonderful novel. So if this is your first taste of Yehoshua and you want to read other things, maybe something with a more contemporary setting, I highly recommend The Liberated Bride. A really canonical Yehoshua novel is The Lover, which is explores what Israel was becoming, what Israel was with the crisis, with the emergency of 1973. There's just actually really can't go wrong with the Yehoshua novel. If you're a particular fan of historical novels, I definitely encourage you to get a hold of what many regard as his most ambitious and accomplished novel, which is Mr. Manny, which looks at a figure called Mr. Manny in each of 5 different generations of Jews. And it really is a wonderful illustration of what the Jewish community is in the diaspora and also in Israel over time. There was a time when I emailed him one of my student essays on The Lover, and he actually called back to leave a long, wonderful, somewhat rambling message, but very effusive response to what the student had said in their paper. And I kept that for many years, constantly until inadvertently I deleted it one day. And in any case, I'm no longer at that institution. Anyway, after his death, David Grossman offered this praise. With Bully, again, that was his nickname, the active agents in a person's soul were not merely those that dwelled between the ordinary reality and the extreme, they were also the products of the layers of time, history, memory, ancestry. He was able to show us how grand history seeps into the soul of the individual, at times bursting forth from within. And there's days that it's hard for me to believe that it's already been 3 years since his death. His lifetime span 1936 to 2022. And as I'm sure you already know, he's a true giant of Israeli literature who was publishing passionate essays and still writing novels right up to the time of his death. I'll mention one more novel. Maybe I'll come and say more of it later, but a very slim book that he wrote that is very poignant because it deals with kind of the demise of the body and the mind, things that he himself was confronting. It's called The Tunnel. And it's a wonderful meditation on contemporary Israel and also the vulnerability of aging. So he was often called one of the three tenors, which, as you probably know, included Amos Oz and Grossman. But not just thinking about the loss of Amos Oz, there's been the passing very lately of so many canonical Israeli writers in recent years. There was Oz, Nava Semmel, a great writer of the Holocaust, Doron Appelfeld, another one, and Meir Shalev, wonderful Bible scholar as well as novelist. And that, coupled with Israel's growing unpopularity amidst this horrible war, seems to me that we may run the risk of foreign interest in Hebrew translations or Hebrew writing maybe dramatically waning, which would be a pity because I think that now more than ever, Yehoshua's morally imaginative voice, which always stresses reason, reconciliation, and the imperative of responsibility, which is something I want to really explore in the book that I'm putting together, that seems to me worth our urgent attention. There's a there's a biography that appeared in Hebrew. It's not translated yet. Very soon after Yehoshua's passing, his biographer is Avi Gil, and he has this very amusing anecdote that shows that already in childhood, Yehoshua demanded a right to participate in the ideological debates besetting Israelis after the establishment of the state. He drew up a contract that he solemnly handed to his parents. This is in 1949. And this 13-year-old future writer claimed the right to talk back to those, according to my logic, are mere, talk back to those who, according to my logic, are mere fools, and to irritate as much as possible, because in my opinion, I am good at it. And those of you who have a little bit of awareness of how Yehoshua interacted with audiences, especially in the diaspora, probably know that he was very good at irritating people. This precocious insistence, though, in his early life on questioning the moral entanglement of the individual and the Jewish state, even though it's a funny anecdote, that really laid the foundation for what was to follow. And when you think about his pretty significant corpus of 11 novels, bunch of novellas, short stories, plays, polemics, it's easy to become, I think, so absorbed just by the exuberant sprawl of all these spatial and temporal settings, the conflicts of these very singular characters, that you can underlook the underlying force, the impetus that drives it all. The works that he wrote are very interrelated, and I'll come back to that theme of responsibility. Always the idea of responsibility, whether that which emanates from the self or from the collective, from Yehoshua as a very public intellectual, a public figure, or from each of his characters grappling with their very diverse challenges. And I think this abiding concern is really the impetus of most of his creative as well as his polemical political works, the force that always sparked his moral and aesthetic imagination, whether he's exploring gaps between the secular and the religious, between East and West, diaspora and Israel, Jewish Israelis, and Israel's Palestinian minority. So, from both the individual and the collective, Yehoshua demands a fuller recognition of the responsibilities inherent in Jewish identity across time and space, and most acutely in Israel. In the wake of the October 7th massacres and the brutal Gaza war, I again really mourn the loss of his reasonable voice, the moral outrage he would surely have directed toward Netanyahu or others that bear responsibility both for Israel's staggering security failures, but also ongoing human rights violations, the fate of the hostages. He would have been in the forefront of those demanding that the government at last exceed to the enormity of the responsibility that it hasn't borne up until now. And I think that when so many Israelis I know feel dejected by a far gloomier reality than many most once anticipated for the state, Yehoshua's very positive sense of responsibility is definitely missed. When he was asked what his dad might have said in the aftermath of October 7th, Yehoshua's son Gidi responded, I don't know. But he would not paint a catastrophe. He would have come up with something original and positive. He would startle us with an unconventional idea to give us strength. The critic John Bailey once said that Yehoshua's characters are born, like he was really, with an exasperating awareness of the wish for independence and the impossibility of being independent. And the severity of that burden is really the paramount trial that governs his work. And that takes a form often, and this goes back to antagonizing Jewish audiences that are not Israeli citizens, the great debate between Israel and the Gola. And that often spills forth in instances of his work in allegorical and in literal ways. It's very nakedly an allegory in the novel The Lover. It also comes up in Yehoshua's second novel, A Late Divorce, where this retired Israeli teacher named Yehuda is sort of caught between America and Israel. And he sort of exclaims at one point, Homeland, will you ever be a homeland? And I think that in the wake of the recent excruciating suffering that we've seen, this remains the empirical question that is still festering for many Israelis. On the other hand, I think Yehoshua himself would almost surely have answered that in the affirmative. Well, Avram Gavriel Yehoshua was born in Jerusalem to Malka and Yaakov Yehoshua. And his father was a very erudite folklorist and an expert on Arab-Israeli affairs. And he belonged to the community of Jews who had lived in Jerusalem for generations. There was a grandfather who was the chief justice of the city's Sephardic religious court. And for her part, Yehoshua's Moroccan-born mother moved to Jerusalem just 4 years before his birth. And after the 48 War of Independence and the siege of Jerusalem, during which shrapnel from a bomb on Ben Yehuda Street destroyed part of their house, Yehoshua's family moved to Tabia, which is this very prosperous neighborhood where he attended Jerusalem's gymnasium, which is a very elite institution that had been established in 1909 as the city's first modern high school. And as I hinted earlier, he was nicknamed Bully by his classmates, and that stuck to the end of his life. There was no one who knew him that called him Yehoshua. They all called him Bully. Yehoshua studied Hebrew lit and philosophy at the Hebrew University, and later he taught Hebrew and comparative literature for many years at Haifa University. He and Rivka were married in 1960, and for her part, she became a very highly respected psychoanalyst, clinical psychologist at Haifa's Carmel Hospital. I mention her because she was always the first reader of the drafts of his manuscripts. And there's no Yehoshua story and no Yehoshua novel where you aren't plunged into deep psychoanalytic portrayals. And I really think she accounts for that deep psychology of his characters. And that must have owed to their relationship and their conversations. I mean, given the pervasive presence of adultery, dysfunctional households, broken marriages, and a certain degree of sexual misconduct in many of his works, it's almost amusing to note the fact that Yehoshua had an extremely traditional marriage that endured from 1960 until her death in 2016. From 1963 to 67, he lived and taught in Paris while Rivka was working on her doctorate in clinical psychology. And I think that was a source of inspiration for one of his most infamous characters, Gabriel, who's this sort of philanderer and Yored, meaning, one who betrays Israel by descending, by leaving the country, who has this untethered identity in France and sort of a weak character. And that individual is intrinsic to this enormous, epic, dysfunctional drama that plays out in The Lover, which, as I said, is really his most explicitly allegorical novel. But despite the fact that in 1973, The Lover's themes of betrayal and very grim post-war atmosphere um, weighed heavily on people, there's still optimism that comes out of the fact that it portrays Haifa itself as having enormously rejuvenating potential. And he explores the fact that in Haifa, even now, good relations between Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel usually persevere in this blue-collar socialist city that takes pride in its largely secular, pluralistic identity. And I think there's little wonder that Yehoshua's most Haifa-oriented work, The Lover, actually concludes with the word hope, which, as you know, happens to be the title of Israel's national anthem. And toward the end of his life, his final years, he reluctantly departed from his beloved city because of reasons of age mostly. The mayor of Haifa saw fit to name an entire square of the city for The Lover. And maybe it's just because the novel has this very quietly redemptive affirmation that the city should serve as a paradigm for the country's future. Yehoshua said that Haifa is the model for what I wanted Israel to be. It was the city where I lived and where I created and which I loved. I also saw harmony between Jews and Arabs and a social consciousness. Haifa is Israel at its best. So, as you probably have a sense, if only from reading the blurbs on the cover of the book, until his death, Yehoshua was seen as this founding father of what came to be known as the Hebrew New Wave, writers who came of age after the establishment of the state and became really savvy interpreters of the drama of contemporary life. But what I think we can appreciate from this novel or anything by him is that even when he's engaging with the heaviest matters of Jewish, Israeli destiny, world history, his writing is rarely grim in tone or outlook. And he can take on lofty themes, but few people could do that with the sparkling wit and the lightness of touch that he mustered, as well as the sense of empathy and warmth that comes through these pages. And in achieving these ends, and I think he has a lot of wonderful female characters as well, but we can really trace a lineage of beleaguered male anti-heroes, such as Adam in The Lover, or Yirmiyahu, which is Hebrew for Jeremiah, who's a bereaved father of a son who's killed in the army in a book called Friendly Fire, and our own Ben Attar in Journey. And along with his close friends, and they were close, Oz and Grossman, Yehoshua weighed in on burning political issues. And he was very enthusiastic about embracing this mantle of prophecy, which is becoming very rare globally, except for a few authors, but was very common in Israel in the generation that he came from. It's not a very attractive role to many that have followed in his footsteps in Israel. A lot of them really resist it. But anyway, over the years, as I said, Yehoshua achieved notoriety for espousing his very hierarchized set of oppositions that enraged audiences in the diaspora, because of his belief in the necessity of consolidating Zionist hegemony, and that Jews had to abandon the historical condition of the diaspora, which for Yehoshua was always a steady march to Auschwitz. Yehoshua looks at the totality of Jewish history, and this is what he sees. Another aspect of his thinking is he really came to reject the American model of hyper individualized identity. And given what's just happened in these terrible shootings in the church, the resultant violence of American society. And he really preferred the sensibility of modern European democracies whose identities were based on what he wanted for Israel: a tight nexus of language, religion, and nationhood. And he was really embittered by what he considered the irresponsibility of the ultra Orthodox. If you're looking at headlines out of Israel, you know there's this tempest about whether or not the ultra Orthodox will serve in the army. And he, going back to the time that he wrote The Lover, was angry that the ultra Orthodox prioritized a life devoted to the study of sacred texts over contributing to the civic life or the defense of the nation, including the burden of army service. Given his rather perverse inclination for provocative statements, Yehoshua could sometimes really piss off both the Israeli right and the left, such as his, something most people aren't aware of today, but he actually expressed support for the first Intifada. A wonderful interlocutor of Yehoshua is Bernard Horn, who came out with a volume of conversations that they conducted together over several years and actually a few decades. And Bernard Horn credits Yehoshua with what he calls a casual audacity for his candor in taking up these really incendiary positions. And I think a little bit like the poet Yehuda Amichai, Yehoshua was uneasy about the post Six Day War, post 1967 hyper nationalist ecstasy over Jerusalem and its festering role in the conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis. And he said once that I have had a strong ideological opposition to Jerusalem ever since 67, especially in the late 1970s and 80s, when the American Jews were coming and playing with the old city as if it were all a kind of sacred toy. And afterwards, the Intifada started, and Jerusalem was again cut into two parts by the Arabs who were saying, we are here also. Please, we are not a non existing entity. We are here. We are a living people. You cannot just impose upon us and take our houses and push us here and there. And you have to consider us. We are people. We have been living here for hundreds of years, so you have to take us into account. And by sort of embodying the voice of the Palestinian there, you can see Yehoshua's gift for empathy. And one of the things I personally love about Yehoshua as an author is that this steady gaze on society of his always included the manifest presence of others. Every decade or so, he returned to this question in his fiction. In the early post 67 war days, he was one of the few who believed that Jerusalem actually should be the capital of two states for two peoples. And a similar logic led him to repudiate the fatal addiction of Israel to the occupied territories, which he saw as an expression of irrational religious impulses instead of a healthy, pragmatic national self interest. And again, you have these critical milestones in his career that move Palestinian Arabs or Muslims front and center in these highly empathic ways that I think inspired later generations of writers. He's challenging himself over the decades to create ever more complex portraits of Palestinian Israeli lives. He begins with this mute figure who is the catalyst for the Jewish Firewatcher's moral discoveries in a famous story of 1963 called Facing the Forests. He plays with the idea of representing the consciousness of that era, but he doesn't give him speech. But then a decade later, in 1977, he has this yearning Arab adolescence in The Lover Who Dares to Fall in Love with a Jewish Girl, the daughter of his boss. And then he has the North African Muslim Abu Lutfi that we spend time with in A Journey. Then from there, he moves on to the politically and ideologically varied cast of adult Israeli Palestinians and West Bank Palestinians in a novel called The Liberated Bride. And so he never wavers from creating characters and situations where readers recognize the traumatic memories and the joint claim to the land of both Israelis and Palestinians. He writes The Liberated Bride during the Second Intifada, when the Oslo process had already collapsed. And it's a kind of labyrinthine work, but it's fascinating. I think it will really hold your attention. And it is very conflicted, and it looks at the problem of identity and borders between Jerusalem and Ramallah and Haifa. And I think more than any other novel of its era, it presents us with very realistic portraits of the sharply divided status of stateless Palestinians, Israeli Arab citizens, Jewish Israelis, and his awareness of the impossibility sometimes of reconciling the incompatibility of Zionist ideals with the tragic outcomes of decades of occupation make this a really vigorous work of moral questioning, but also one with fascinating characters who really live on the page and haunt you afterwards. Then there's a couple of other works I'd like to mention that are unexpectedly related because they sort of explore the true nature of just what constitutes a civilized society. Yehoshua, I think, really surpassed himself by what was revealed to him during the writing process of his 2004 novel, A Woman in Jerusalem, which was made into a wonderful film as well called The Human Resource Man or Human Resources Man. One critic called it resonantly dense, at once Kafka and Faulkner-esque. And Yehoshua was surprised by the nature of the moral journey that he experienced while writing this very spare, hallucinatory narrative. He said of it that I'm not religious, but a certain religious energy erupted in this book. I tried to restore meanings that we have lost, the meaning of Jerusalem, the spiritual meaning of Jerusalem. Suddenly, I noticed that Jerusalem has become rather tattered within the Jewish-Arab conflict. Both we and the Palestinians are completely losing its global spiritual dimension. So I mentioned a few minutes earlier this very late work called The Tunnel, which got a lot of acclaim when it appeared here. It's a pretty quick read. And there again, I see themes of social responsibility and spiritual awakening. The plight of Palestinian refugees, or at least one group of them, is predominant. There's also an admiring portrayal of the activities of Road to Recovery. Road to Recovery is this volunteer organization that for a long time assisted Palestinians who were seeking medical care in Israel coming out of Gaza. And some of the staff of this organization were brutally murdered by Hamas on October 7th, including an 83-year-old man named Oded Lifshitz, whose body was returned to Israel just in late February this year. Anyway, that story is really worth looking into. It concerns a retired Jewish highway engineer with pretty advanced dementia who gets tangled up in the plight of a Palestinian paterfamilias who's living clandestinely in the Nabatean archaeological ruins of a Negev hilltop. And that basically sums up its plot. It's not terribly eventful, but it just beautifully, boldly lays bare the struggle over Israel's national values. And in both of these novels, it's the plight of minorities that stirs something in the protagonists. And this is a dynamic that Yehoshua himself identified as what he called a personal quest, a turbulence, in unrest. And ultimately, he directed this toward accomplishing something, repairing reality, and taking responsibility. And this, I think, his last really major work, that's, I think, a nice way for Yehoshua to go out, this optimism that humanity and reason could prevail. Many years ago, the legendary critic and Bible scholar Robert Alter offered what I think is really a surprisingly prescient observation about what distinguished Yehoshua, what distinguished his literary imagination. And this formulation, I think, really stands a test of time. Alter said that the characteristic Yehoshua world is a world of incompletions. These incompletions manifest themselves both in projects undertaken and in acts of communication attempted. And Yehoshua built up his fictional creations by always wrestling with paradoxes and ambivalences and uncertainties and frustrations, whether those were personal or social, political. These are the things that always consumed him. He always demanded rigor and intellectual honesty in himself. Even though he held fast to the diaspora, bad, Israel, good dichotomy, he could change his views in a lot of different ways. At one point, he began to disavow the two-state solution that he had fiercely advocated for ever since 67. And he began to write about the idea of a unified homeland for Jews and Arabs that would have full equality for all. He wrote this in the pages of Haaretz. He wrote, the apartheid process, striking deep roots in our life, is far more dangerous, and uprooting it will soon be impossible. It is not the Jewish or Zionist identity I fear for, but something more important, our humanity and the humanity of the Palestinians in our midst. We will live with the Palestinians for eternity, and every wound and bruise in relations between the two peoples will be engraved in the memory and passed on from one generation to the next. Imagine what he might say today with this forever war that we seem to be caught up in now. Anyway, regardless, that was clearly a very brave change of heart from his earlier anxiety about commingling and what are going to happen with the Arab demographic versus a Jewish demographic. But you can see that he still clings to this very progressive view of Jewish history and the incomplete Zionist enterprise. He said once that Jewish identity existed for thousands of years as a small minority within large, powerful nations. So there's no reason for it not to exist also in an Israeli state, even though it contains a Palestinian minority so large that it can be termed a bi-national state. And I think that's a fairly kind of radical position for him to take, given his more sort of classical um, maybe conservative Zionism that he clung to for a long time. And I think even in this very traumatized moment we're in now, he would almost certainly remind us that no matter how much some might wish it otherwise, neither Israelis nor Palestinians are going away. So anyway, as for the novel at hand, as for a journey to the end of the millennium, which is this second great historical novel, I think that there's nothing really to compare to the way it evokes this era that is fraught with both peril and promise. It's very liminal that way. We have the sphere of Mediterranean Jews, the world of the Benatars. You can see the fruitful cultural collaboration of Muslims and Jews. We understand that they are the shared inheritors of Arabic and Greek philosophy before the destructive waves of Islamic fundamentalism and persecution, and the later violence and expulsion of the Christian reconquest of Spain. And even if we look at the other side in this novel, what's going on in Northern Europe, well, there's still a century of life before the Crusader massacres of Rhineland Jewish communities. Yehoshua is very attentive to the sense of at-homeness that his characters enjoy, which I find very interesting given that he's always trying to repudiate the diaspora. So you get rabbinic dynasties like the Kalanamids, the family to which Esther Mina belongs, invited by the authorities of the Holy Roman Empire to move from Italy to the Germanic lands. They establish these vibrant colonies that are distinguished by religious and also commercial growth. And again, we think of Yehoshua in his polemics and also other works of fiction, railing against the failures of the diaspora. But here he's just caught up in a time when anti-Semitic rage was a less critical matter than the differences between Jews themselves. And maybe for some of us, you guys will talk later and say the parts you like, but I think that for a lot of us, the best parts are just how he evokes the very distinct worlds of the Jewish characters, the sensual, the colorful robes, veils of the South, and their more worldly approach to faith, and how that contrasts with the kind of cold, pinched drabness of the Rhineland Jews, whose Judaism comes across as a little smothering and rigid. And then there's the critical way that Yehoshua is exploring language. The Southerners speak and write Arabic, while the Northerners, Frankish or High German, the language that's going to blend with Hebrew and eventually evolve into Yiddish. And one of the things I like to remind people, because we often forget this, is that Jews over time wrote far more in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic than they wrote in Yiddish. Anyway, the common linguistic ground that they share is that the male elites of both Sephardi and Ashkenazi traditions in Hebrew, they have that. They have the Hebrew. So when they come together, the Sephardics and the Ashkenazim, they have this lingua franca. This is their spoken communication with each other. And I think that is how Yehoshua is using those two communities and their arguments with one another to kind of wink at the future Jewish state, the Jewish state of the time of his writing. Stylistically, though Yehoshua is obviously writing in modern Hebrew, which is very different from medieval Hebrew, he's, as you can guess, he's employing antique inflections and these kind of semantic flourishes to capture it. And what's great about our translation by Nicholas Delange, who was also a great translator of Amos Oz, is that the translation pulls that off very well. He makes the language have this kind of archaic kick to it. I don't know about you, and we'll hear from you shortly, but I think that part of the pleasure of this novel is that we come to realize that despite this exoticism, Yehoshua is thinking very rigorously about the problem of identity politics. He seems almost to be giving the finger to the dominant Ashkenazi Jewish ultra-Orthodox establishment. He's really writing here as a proud Sephardi Jew, 5 generations in Jerusalem, and he sees himself as like embodying this native Zionism that doesn't really need a political Zionist, because he expresses a natural indigeneity. And if we look through the prism of the Benatars that represent the Jewish Mediterranean civilization, probably at its height, then the beleaguered northern Jewish settlements that are established in the heart of Christendom can seem kind of pitiful by comparison. Their religious life is so legalistic and parochial, it can feel almost soulless. And Yehoshua, for better or for worse, wants us to regard them as the ancestors of the Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox of his own time. And I think in a philosophic as well as in a social sense, Yehoshua is rendering Sephardic culture as the vigorous bearer of what we could call eros, while the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi culture represents kind of thanatos. Erotic conflict often functions symbolically. It has cultural, political subtexts in Yehoshua's imagination. The marital quandary in this novel is kind of a metaphor for the medieval Jewish trader's hybrid cultural condition, which can bridge the East and the West. And he's underscoring the intense contact that Sephardic culture did have with Arabs, in stark contrast to the East European Jews, for whom the Arab just represents a rumor of the truly alien. And after Abu Lafia's first wife dies, and he marries this powerful, very headstrong widow from Worms, who compels him to repudiate his Jewish partner, his commercial and cultural ties with the Muslim trader Abu Latafi. We're supposed to think about attitudes in the present. The conflict is set over 1,000 years ago, but that doesn't deflect in the least from Yehoshua's, I think, his clear intentions to mirror the tensions that still exist between very different Judaisms. One that grew when it was confidently open to what was then a relatively tolerant Islam, and the other growing inwardly because of its harsher treatment by a more xenophobic Christianity. And I think that Yehoshua's embrace of the riches of his ethnic heritage served him as a catalyst for reimagining Israeli history. The historian Amnon Raz Krakotskin has this call for the critical historian's unique role, which I think Yehoshua felt the novelist could undertake. Raz Krakotskin wrote about the need to write Israeli history from the standpoint of the oppressed, from within a unique and contradictory situation in which Mizrahim, Jews of the East, are Jews in a Jewish state, but at the same time in a Jewish society that defines itself as a negation of their culture. And maybe we ourselves would want to argue with these kinds of rigid cultural dichotomies as Yehoshua imagines them or portrays them. But I think it's hard to resist the genuinely endearing figure of Ben Attar, who has loving, passionate attention to both his wives, as if love is what? Not a finite human resource, but a boundless human resource. And I think it's the richness of his characters and their situations that really make this a great novel, whether we feel comfortable with the binary opposition of this cultural logic. That in the end we're left with this expansive imagining of Jewish and human potentiality. And I think that the wonder in writing this kind of sweeping historical novel is that he could accomplish these grand gestures with a sort of nonchalance, a casual approach, with humor, with ease. And he could imbue his characters, he could imbue us, his readers, with a gaze, with an orientation that could be both sarcastic and skeptical, but also loving and ironic and amazed. Sorry about the dog in the background. Michael, maybe I'll stop there and you can say more. And
Sure.
okay.
Sure. Thank you. That was a great introduction.